right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and I'm going to get settled here. 1 second, we're going to get started on this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. Real quick, just want to say thank you guys so much for hanging out here and being here. Wanted to give a little shout out to William Jevning with his new book coming out. I'll have some more information on that this next week. It's going to be pretty awesome. This is really going to be covering a lot of the Bigfoot evidence, kind of how it's gathered, types of evidence, things like that. But it's going to be, you know, usually as anything William Jevning does, it's packed full of great information. So look forward to that. I look forward to that. I'm going to go grab that as soon as it comes out in just a few weeks here. Other than that, let me get a sip of the old Sasquatch coffee. All right. Clear the old throat. It's morning. I'm doing this one in the morning, very early in the morning. It's still mostly dark outside, so here in the Pacific Northwest. But we're going to get to it. Let's do this. Woman runs into a Bigfoot near Quilcene, Washington. I had moved to Quilcene, Washington to start fresh, I guess you could say, and I never thought I'd run into a Bigfoot while living there ever. I never considered myself a nature lover either until the late 1990s when I moved to Quilcene. To be honest, the only wild things or animals I'd ever seen were in a zoo, being from Southern California and all. But there I was that day, walking as usual when I saw a Bigfoot. And it was not alone. My Bigfoot encounter in Quilcene. I had gotten a divorce, not that I wanted one, but things happened and that was that, and I found myself alone after 6 years of marriage and wanting to forget it all and move on, literally. So I moved to the state of Washington to a small town named Quilcene, literally over 1,000 miles away from what was home for 2 decades and then some. I lived there for nearly 3 years, and there were some pretty weird experiences I will mention here because I do believe they were Bigfoot related. But it was not until that one summer evening when I finally, or knew finally for sure, what it was. Well, a Bigfoot. To be honest, I never heard the stories until I moved here. Being born and raised in Southern California, we simply did not hear about it, I suppose. I was just oblivious. So I moved, as I said. We sold off the house, which was a sizable sum in the end. My husband was an attorney, and we lived in a pretty popular part of LA area near the beach. The money would help me move, resettle, and even live on some of it for some time to come. No, I did not get it all at first, but enough that kept me from having to be in a hurry to find out what I was going to do with the rest of my life, and enough to relocate at least. My new home. I can't tell you why I chose Kilseen, the pearl of the peninsula, the locals called it. It was far away, but very beautiful. Growing up in the city and spending a few years in Hawaii, the Pacific Northwest seemed different, rugged, and yet beautiful and serene. I took the trip up there, and by the time I toured around the Olympic Peninsula once, I was sold. I liked it enough that I leased a small home near the water. It was literally just outside of the town, less than a mile, and yet in the thick of the woods and beach. It really is beautiful here, or there. I only moved because of work. But that is enough of why I was here. Here is what started happening and what I came within 30 or so feet of one summer afternoon or early evening. I was a runner at that point, at least, living in East Kilseen. There was trails around, one running the edge of the beach, my favorite one. I usually ran twice a day, once early in the morning, usually right before sunrise, once later in the day, usually right before sunset. Why? Well, personally, I spent the first year still hurting. I was mad, hurt, I just felt betrayed and embarrassed after the divorce. Running seemed to be to help me cope and eventually work through the anger, I suppose. I was there about 4 or 5 months when I noticed some strangeness one early morning on a run. It was wood knocks, like wood on wood sounds, just to the east of me where the woods became really thick here with trees and high brush. I was down towards the bend where Deba Bay would come into a pretty glorious view as the sun came up. Yes, Quilcene Bay was great too, but my runs took me around the bend. The knocking started about the time I hit the bend in the trail that would take me into a beautiful view of Deba Bay. At first, I thought it was someone splitting wood, but as I moved on, the sound seemed to either be following me or there was a great echo going on. Either way, it sounded less like an axe hitting wood and more like a bat hitting a tree. By that point, I'd been running for some time now and had experienced nothing. Well, except for my first ever killer whale encounter that scared me to death practically when one breached just offshore one morning. This was not scaring me, however, but it was weird nonetheless, I recall. It would come in twos and threes, knock, 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 from the woods. It would last until I finally came to the end of the bend, and I would turn and head back home. I believe to this day that was the first experience I'd have with a Bigfoot. Footprints on the beach. A year later, and no weird sounds in the morning, I would be running one evening and come across something really odd. Footprints on a beach. When the tide goes out here, it is rather mucky. You don't really go running around on the beach, at least not me. That day the tide was high and I wanted to walk back home and follow the beach instead of the small trail. I was halfway back home when I noticed what looked like huge footprints in what sand there was. It was early summer, and the footprints or tracks were up high on the beach, almost on the trail. And even though the sand was not deep like at Santa Monica Beach up near the trail itself, I could still tell these were footprints. One, in fact, I could see toes. Not plain as day toes, but you could make out a big toe, and the next two smaller ones. They seemed to come out of the woods, down to the top of the beach area, and head back into the woods about 15 yards down or so. I admit that the only one showing toes was in fact the only one that did, but the impressions were unmistakably footprints, and there was only one set of 2 feet. What caught my attention was not that they was what they were, but the mere size of them. They were huge. I am a short person, small feet, trust me, but these things must have been 17 inches long, give or take, only an inch maybe. That was the second time I'd noticed something that later would have the light shine on it because of what I saw for myself. More knocks, and something new. A couple weeks after finding the footprints on the beach that unfortunately disappeared in a single night from the high tide, it was pretty quiet. But one afternoon, early evening, the wood knocking was back. Up to that point, I'd seen pictures and seen the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but still, as a native Californian, Southern Californian at that, I did not make the connection of the possibility that this thing was real. It was near 6:30 p.m. when I decided to take another shorter run that day. Once again, as I approached the bend in the peninsula, the knocking started up again. It really did sound like wood on wood and not an axe. This time I stopped and stood there looking into the trees, straining my eyes to see if I could see anything. The knocks came in twos and threes, like the time before. I noticed to my own surprise, thinking I'd missed it before, but there were 7 trees along the trail, broken, snapped off, and the tops laying next to the original trees that had come from it, it seemed. It was all odd enough to have me feeling a bit uncomfortable. Even if it was a person hacking away at trees out there, that would still be an odd area in which to do that, and so I felt quite uneasy. I turned around before completing my run, and all the while the knocking continued until I was out of the area. Looking back a day or two later, the trees I recall were broken off, and more like they were snapped off at about 8 to 9 feet up, not cut. That I knew was a fact. On the trail again. It took me a week, but by the middle of July, I was back to running up the bay again, feeling good and feeling comfortable. I'd finally had a talk about what I was hearing and seeing with a new friend I'd made down at the local cafe, a waitress who was about my age and, of course, divorced. After a few visits, I had opened up more and we became friends. She, my friend, and I'll keep her name out of it for now, But she's a Native American and in the know, if you will, apparently, about the animal known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Well, she called it another. She had another name for it, but it was big. It was a Bigfoot she was telling me about. I have to admit, she was quite compelling when it came to the stories she shared. But I was not biting too hard. I handled them like anything else, stories until I saw for myself. See it to believe it, I guess. Well, boy, did I. She told me that the signs I was experiencing were a possible Bigfoot, that it was making a home or protecting young possibly, or maybe just trying to get me to move on from its current hunting ground. No matter what she believed the reason was, I was still not a believer just yet. Personally, I thought there was a human reason behind what I'd heard and noticed up to that point. A couple days later, after the Bigfoot conversation with my friend, I'd finally opened my eyes enough to see that Bigfoot or Sasquatch was everywhere in Washington. From knickknacks to coffee mugs and so on, I started seeing this thing everywhere. Funny. That is what I thought it all was, however. But I was out that evening once again, and the Bigfoot and what I'd seen and heard before had all but disappeared from my mind. I had received a call the day before that confirmed the sale of my ex-husband's house, of my and my ex-husband's house in Santa Monica. I was to receive the rest of my settlement in just a few weeks, but the memories all fresh in my head still started flooding back, and I was mad, sad, and confused all over again. A run would do me good. This time I wore headphones. I was done with the sounds of nature. That day, I wanted music. I wanted to drown out the world at the moment, I suppose. On my run, I started to see something. A shape. Well, a couple shapes in the woods as I approached the bend where the tip of the peninsula met the bay. X's. That is what they were. My X's. There were two for sure, but I think I saw one more. But it was so far back I cannot completely make it out. But these two were unmistakable. Four trees, thin ones, yes, tall nonetheless, were all bent and slightly broken down into a shape of an X right off the trail. I'd never seen anything like it before, ever. I had to admit at the time I thought people or young adults had to be the cause for this, but later, after doing a bit of research myself, it was, or most likely at least, the Bigfoot I would see not one summer later. They seemed to be blocking what looked like small game trails I'd noticed before. It was at that moment that I realized I had not seen a deer in a couple, 2 or 3 weeks near or around the areas I usually would. Once again, weirdness set in, and I felt a bit uneasy. Moments later, after deciding that was far enough for my run, I heard the knocking again. This time, however, and against my better judgment, I stopped and tried to listen closer. It was wood on wood, and embarrassingly enough, I'll admit, I would try it myself in my yard the next day. Literally, I would whack a large broken limb against a tree to mimic the sound I heard. The sound was similar, but the other near the base seemed a little louder and harder, I guess. Maybe she was using a larger limb or branch of a tree. And yes, I called it a she, because I would see her one summer later. Summer 11. Happy at last. That following summer, I was feeling pretty good, happier, and I was even an inch away from dating someone. We were going out, I suppose, but I was not ready for that kind of commitment at the time. We did have the conversations about what I had experienced the previous summer, and even his response was Bigfoot. He explained much of what he knew over dinner one evening. I have to say, the words he spoke, the description of what they looked like, and some of their behavior matched what my friend at the cafe had told me before. But it had been just over a year since I'd experienced anything along that trail. The bay was silent, and even the X's along the trail had been gone. The trees were downed by strong winter winds over the last year. I had also started running with him, and that week, in the day of my visual, he was out of town on business and training a training seminar for a company he worked for. I decided on a run, and one out and around my new beloved bay. The trees bent down and the X's were in fact gone, like I said. No knocking sounds, just a cool breeze that felt good that hot summer day. Well, early evening at least. It had hit a record-breaking heat wave in the region, from what I gathered, but I was from Southern California, so it was not so bad to me. I had rounded the bend to get a great view of Debal Bay. I kept moving in place, stretching, and finally turned to head back just as the sun was starting to set. It was a long run every time, but one that I loved and missed at the time as I was running with my friend in town for the previous few months. I was thinking of life and the new things happening in it when I looked up and got the shock of my life. The wild woman of Quilcene. She was standing there, almost in the middle of the trail, a tall, dark, hairy figure. Just stood there as if it had been there the whole time and I was unaware and ran right past her. At first I thought it was a person because it had arms and legs and stood on two legs just like one of us. It was its posture and arms and height that made me thinking otherwise almost instantly. I could see this thing pretty well, even its face, as it was literally within 30 feet of me. The hair was not as dark as I thought at first either. It was very reddish brown and heavy on the red. The hair seemed covered in tangles and dirty looking. However, especially near the head and shoulders, seemed almost dreaded, I guess you could say. It also seemed to be rather long, especially along the arms, where it dangled off at least 3 inches, give or take. She was tall, massive, maybe 4 feet in width, at least at the shoulders and upper torso. The head was cone shaped, seriously cone shaped, with even a kind of point on the top, and no neck, just one big cone shaped head on shoulders, it seemed. The face seemed dark complected, very dark, almost black, but with it facing the light, I could see it clearly. It looked like a monkey except for the nose and eyes. They seemed rather human, truth be told. But you got a sense that this thing, this female Bigfoot, was a wild animal. She was a she, as there were breasts on this thing. And later, I would seriously consider the fact the knocking and such had to do with her having a young one or two, but that is, and was, my own opinion at the time. Maybe that is the reason for the X's, to keep people out of the woods, away from her young. She had an almost sneer on her face, too, as she stared at me. She kept moving her fingers, like you would if your hand or arm fell asleep and you wanted to get the blood flowing again. She also kept looking to her left into the woods every split second or so, then back at me with that creepy, scary sneer. I was trapped between her, the bay, and home. I was really scared. So much so, I was shaking in my runners on a day that seemed to be over 90 degrees, and swimming was not off the escape route. I could tell she was warm too, as I could see sweat roll down her face and forehead that was massive with a huge brow line that had almost no hair on it. The mouth was small, like a slit basically, but she opened it once and the teeth seemed, well, blocked. She stood there for a few more seconds with that sneer, and suddenly she stepped forward one very long step, gave a bark at me, or in my direction, then literally leaped off the trail and into the trees. I could hear her as she walked off through the thick brush, and she kept up the barking sound every second at least, until it and she disappeared. I ran, and fast, until I made it home and collapsed on the floor of my living room. Seattle bound. I never told a soul but my friend the very next day after it happened until now about my experience. I like your encounter stories and figured it was about time I shared mine. I never told my somewhat boyfriend at the time either. Besides, we did not last long after the encounter. I was still not ready for the direction he wanted to go in and at that speed he wanted to go. But she was real. Bigfoot does exist, and this one seemed wild, but not dangerous, I believe. But saying that, they do seem wild, and animals should never be trusted. There was a wildness in her eyes, and I could tell, well, I got the feeling she was very, very territorial, period. I am not sure of their disposition or how wild they are, though I am no expert. I do know that this one did not try to harm me, and although I was scared to death, it did not try to attack me or anything like that. A warning with the bark, maybe, but that was it. But like I said, I was really, really scared, and I hope to never come across one of these things again. They are really frightening to encounter. Thanks, Kristen.